So this project is a work in progress, and you're catching me kind of in the middle of a process of analyzing data that we've collected throughout 2016. So all your feedback is welcome. This project was a rapid response to the catastrophic earthquakes that happened in April 2015 in Nepal. I'd been conducting research in Nepal going back to 2004 and was actually planning on going on sabbatical that year and conducting a 10-year interval of relooking at the work I had done. During that time, the earthquakes happened, and I decided that I needed to rethink the work that I was doing to either be relevant to what was going on in Nepal or to wait. So we put together this project, and we're lucky enough to get funding from NSF's RAPID program, and the research was collected throughout 2016. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of the theoretical framework and a conceptual model for the project, and then from there I'm going to give you a brief introduction of the methodology and the context of the research. We just finished collecting all the data, so the model has not been animated yet, so I can't talk to you a lot about it other than the concepts. But I'm going to be reviewing some of the observations we've had through the descriptive statistics and the qualitative data to show you some of the building blocks that might be the foundation of the model once we start building it. So to begin with, ethnographic and survey research in disaster contexts can uncover the dynamic, plural, and hybrid ways that people understand and respond to natural hazards, how multiple actors function simultaneously and with fluidity in those contexts, the ways in which political, economic factors influence recovery and reconstruction, how populations learn through experimentation and innovation in these circumstances, and that recovery is a multi-stage process that's overlapping and occurs over weeks, months, and years. Most of this literature views natural hazards and vulnerabilities as creating natural disasters, and this is an important distinction that the social sciences have brought to this research, that various vulnerabilities mitigate natural hazards and therefore they become natural disasters. That means that natural hazards happen globally, but that natural disasters may not, depending on the vulnerabilities of those areas. Therefore, disasters are typically primarily a result of human actions. Hazards are natural, disasters are not. And the different vulnerabilities that the literature speaks of are social vulnerabilities, for example, structural inequalities like the caste system in South Asia, procedural vulnerabilities or capacity of the state to be weak to respond to these events. An example of this would be FEMA in the United States. And structural vulnerability, which refers to the actual architecture, structures, and engineering, and whether or not they are vulnerable to seismic events or other natural hazards. So the way that I'm in the literature, there's been holes or aspects of it that need to be engaged that have been pointed out as gaps in the lit that need to be thought through. One of them is that there's poor theorization in the disaster literature, and that one lesson from one disaster is not applied to another. It's very common for the research in disaster context to use ethnography, which is our tradition in anthropology, to do thick description, to do deep dives on particular issues, and often they're descriptive, focusing on human agency. And that's an amazing amount of copious, wonderful work, but the lessons learned from that work are difficult to communicate from one context to the next. Also, there hasn't been much longitudinal research where we can look at before an earthquake, immediately after, and then over time. And also, there's a lack of dialogue occurring across disciplines, which means folks in anthropology, sociology, geography, science studies, environmental engineering, and planning might not be talking to each other and might actually be saying the same things. Therefore, I decided to integrate a socio-ecological systems perspective into this research that looks at humans and the environment as interdependent and having dual feedbacks. And as part of this research, it's inherently interdisciplinary, where we're asking questions that are relevant from both the social and ecological side. Even though primarily we're looking at social transitions in this study, we're interested in those social transitions as they act upon the environmental connections that people have within their system. Therefore, we're using research and research methods that might be useful to other modalities and other disciplines like GIS. And lastly, this research can be context-specific, but also longitudinal over time to look at temporal dynamics. And this is one of the bigger weaknesses that we've seen in the literature on disaster. So I'm conceiving natural hazards turning into disasters like this, where you have the natural hazard being mitigated by different forms of vulnerability. And those vulnerabilities act on a social-ecological system with dual feedbacks and then cause the disaster. So depending on where these vulnerabilities are at, you have what comes as the result. And the innovation here would be also to look at the social and ecological systems as interconnected and dependent upon each other. From there, I'm moving this research into a discussion on something called critical transitions or regime shifts. And this is work that's been done mostly in the natural sciences, and I'm going to borrow heavily from ecology here to try and understand this process and apply it to social transitions. So over time, whether a socio-ecological system is resilient to a natural hazard or transforms into another configuration depends on its capacity to adapt to that shock and learn, and also have feedbacks that are capable of self-learning and organization and adaptation. Resilience in this sense is the intended sense of both adaptation and recovery, and there's a focus on resilience for whom and for what in this equation, which has been a critique on the term resilience, which folks in here I'm sure agree has been quite a buzzword over the last 5 to 10 years. Lastly, resilience in the face of human disaster often relies on human agency and will vary and can be improved through human intervention. So in this research, in order to understand these complex systems that have these feedbacks and trying to understand whether or not a shock like an earthquake would cause the system to change to another configuration, we borrowed this rule of hand from ecology, which states that you select 3 to 5 key variable classes within the sociological system to understand how it's adapting and changing over time. And by and large, what we're looking at is the adaptive capacity of different communities to recover, which I'll explain in a second. We borrowed the rule of hand and helped it guide some of our survey questions so that we could look at the literature and see what the literature is saying the key determinants of recovery from natural disasters are, so that our research could follow that same line and that we would be informed by it. So through that, we selected 5 different variable classes. One of them is institutional participation, livelihood diversity, connectivity, social memory, and hazard exposure. Hazard exposure is a very unique one because it mitigates, and all these other classes have to be affected by this. So even if you have lots of connectivity, lots of local decentralized governance and participation in community-based organizations, you still might be close to a bunch of landslides or living at a very difficult slope, or even at a place where there's increased forest fire risk, or in this case, we're going to talk a lot about landslides. So I'll explain that to you in a second. So we also then created recovery indicators to try and understand what adaptive capacity really means. And if you'll notice, these are all tangible recovery indicators, and that's done on purpose because we accept the fact that the intangible also exists and will not be captured by our data here. So instead of having just tangible indicators, we also have qualitative component to our project with over 80 hours of recorded and transcribed in-depth interviews that talk about local conceptions of recovery, what folks define as what their livelihoods are, how they were affected, how they would feel that those could be changed or shifted in order to recover from this event. So this is the model that we're proposing to look at that I'd like to add to the literature, where you have the 4 different, we'll call them latent variables here, and different indicators feeding them. And all of these indicators have different, multiple data points packed into them that were within our surveys. And you'll notice here that they're all interconnected, mitigated by hazard exposure, and then shows adaptive capacity or our recovery indicators. So we're not there yet, but what we'd like to do is use multivariate statistics like non-metric multidimensional scaling or structural equation modeling to try and better understand if these different independent variables can predict results in this variable. And we're just beginning that process now. Over time, as we keep following these communities and conducting that research, we'll be able to see whether or not our model shows they have high or low adaptive capacity. And then we're theorizing that high adaptive capacity will mean that the sociological system looks quite similar or contains some learning and adaptation, but it maintained its essential structures or transformed into a different system over time. So the broader impacts of this type of research are to help governments and aid communities in future disaster contexts be more aware of complexity and be able to build on local resilience. We also are viewing natural disasters as focusing events where you can see the inequalities that are existing already in Nepal through the event. So by having the earthquake happen, it's putting a microscope on the haphazard aid distribution that existed before the event, as well as the weakness of the state to respond to the event. Lastly, we are working together with different NGOs, local institutions, and governments to feed this information back to them so that they can do appropriate interventions with the work they're already doing. Also, this work lends itself to social and environmental advocacy, and because we're asking academic questions that might come together quite slowly, we're also producing photo blogs every 6 months that get the word out on what we're finding. They're a lot more set up like needs assessments so that we can get the word out on how the communities are feeling, amplify the story that's going on without feeling like we're going to report back in 5 years once our model's ready. Okay. So that's a little bit of an introduction of how we're framing the project and how we're selecting Nepal as a case study. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the Nepal earthquakes and the research that we conducted. Here you're looking at the geography of the South Asia. And what's going on here that's causing the earthquakes is you have two different plates, the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate, one smacking into the other, and it grows the Himalayas. And at the point where those plates come together, we have more common occurrences of earthquakes. And so the Sichuan earthquake, or the Gujarat earthquake of 2001, the Kashmir earthquake of 2005, those are all examples of seismic activity along those border regions. So on April 25th, 2015, around noon, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake shook Nepal. Landslides followed, and this was exacerbated by a monsoon after that. 1 month later, a 7.3 earthquake compounded the damage, and there were subsequent aftershocks throughout that are actually still continuing. The earthquakes killed, both of them put together, 9,200 people, injured over 22,000, permanently destroyed 600,000 buildings, and damaged 150,000 more. So try and wrap your head around the infrastructure of this nation and what happened to it. This also displaced 2.8 million people. These are just some shots of what it looked like. The earthquake hit every area differently. You had areas that had every single structure annihilated. You had some areas where only select things had problems. You had areas where the earthquake happened and it was followed by a fire that burnt down the rest of the village. So it was very heterogeneous how this was experienced, and it's not necessarily how close you were to the epicenter that equated with the damage because of the way in which the fragile slopes fell and the different other cascading effects that resulted from the earthquake and its effects. These are the lessons still on the board of a school that was hit by the earthquake that's been completely depopulated since. Luckily, the earthquake happened on a Saturday when the 7,000 schools that were destroyed by the earthquake were not in session. So our basic research question is, what are the key social and cultural structures that drive how different socio-ecological systems recover from the 2015 earthquakes? And in particular, we're hypothesizing the roles of connectivity, institutional context, livelihood, and social memory as creating adaptive capacity to natural hazards in rural mountain ecosystems. We selected our sites by looking at the 14 earthquake-affected districts and decided to pick the epicenter and one district that had high impacts from landslides as our examples. From there, we selected 2 VDCs, which are the equivalent of a municipality or a local administrative district in each one, and we did a pilot study in November, December 2015 to identify them. We utilized these different criteria in order to pick them: accessibility, the amount of aid that was there, market connections, whether they've been relocated to camps, and the presence or absence of hydropower, which I'll explain to you in a moment. And secondly, we were looking at ethnic and linguistic diversity and evidence of decentralized governance, mostly in natural resource management. So here are our 4 sites. You'll see here is the epicenter of the earthquake. This is Gorkha district. This is Rasua district. Aruchinote, Kashigao are both in Gorkha, and Haku and Gatlang are both in Rasua. And I'm going to go through each one, give you a little bit of an introduction. You'll see here, this is Kathmandu. Here are the 2 districts on the map. So for our research, we conducted 2 research phases, one January through April 2016 and one in September to November 2016. We enrolled 400 households in the study, which equated to 1,992 people, 100 people per VDC through a random selection that we received from a census that was done after the earthquake. So it was probably the most up-to-date census existing at Nepal at the time. From there, we also mapped, we geo-referenced every single household so that we could connect the data to the spatial aspects, which I'll talk about the importance of that later in our work. Phase 2, we recontacted the original households. We were able to find 399 out of the 400. Only one had left the area completely. And of those, we were able to find 349 of the original respondents and 51 new respondents. Our household survey was set up so that it could be done by multiple members of the household so that we could keep the research going over the years. And therefore, by doing 2 points of data collection, it gives us 3 points in time: before the earthquake, 36 to 46 weeks after, and 68 to 78 weeks after. The reason why we picked 36 to 46 as the time for us to start was because that was the time the National Rebuilding Program began. And we felt that most of the chaos that was going on in the relief phase, which is the time when most folks give money, when most NGOs are engaged, and I'm going to show you how that process changes over time, we wanted that to happen, and we wanted the rebuilding in all ways it was going to be done to ensue. So we decided 9 months was a good time to begin, and then 1.5 years as the second interval. We plan to continue conducting this research in years 3, 5, 7, and 10 after the earthquakes, and continue following these families as much as we can in order to better understand whether or not their systems that they're living in are changing or not. So just a reminder that, obviously we can't speak to this now, but over time we'll be able to speak to this aspect. And literature will point out that both the idea of resilience and what transformation is poorly understood. So we're hoping we can add to that. So here are our households. Every single one of these purple dots are the enrolled households within the VDCs. I know they're clustered in these places. The numbers are the different administrative wards in each VDC, and there are 9 in each one. So you can kind of see the spread of the households in each area. I'm going to begin with Aruchinote. This was our largest community. It's accessible by road. It takes about 8 to 12 hours from Kathmandu by Jeep, depending on how fast, comfortable, and safe the roads are. And you'll notice here that in this VDC, there's a concentration of households in wards 1 and 2. And that's because there's a market area there, and that's where the road goes. So you actually have 2 different worlds happening in Aruchinote, a urbanizing area where people are migrating in to conduct business, as well as areas to the north that look like it's a completely different place, and the impacts from the earthquake show these results. So here's the bazaar area. This is what the northern wards look like, so much different construction. Everything needs to be carried up beyond wards 1 and 2. And this is an example where I want to kind of show you some of this spatial inequality, whereas this school that's in the northern part of the VDC is still in use, but it has earthquake damage to it. I'd like everyone here to imagine going to school there in the winter and what that would be like. And this would never happen here because this is where the majority of the aid was concentrated. Nepal used the VDC as the indicator of how they gave the money out. So this is one of the problems that we're running into, that the money is being given out only to certain places that have more accessibility, like the southern wards here, and less to the areas that are off the map, who are by and large invisible in the first place in, for example, the Nepal census, which has been known to have quite a number of holes in it. And folks didn't necessarily travel to these less accessible areas. Another important point to think about is the development of hydropower in this area. There's going to be a very large dam being built on the Budagandaki River, which is actually the largest dam ever planned in Nepal's history. Here's some of the statistics on the dam and what it's going to provide. But what it's going to do, and you kind of see it a little bit in this picture, it's going to cause an inundation zone. Right? As we're removing dams over here in the west, we're building dams in South Asia and East Asia right now. This dam in itself is going to be inundating all of these red triangles, which are households involved in our study. Okay? So can you only imagine if you had your house completely destroyed, what were you going to do if in 5 years you're going to be dislocated to another place because of the building of this dam? So folks are kind of caught in this liminal situation here, especially in southern Arutinote, because of that plan, which is going forward, and they have already started relocating people. And the relocation of people depends on their proximity to the road or the market, which is going to reinforce the same structural inequality that was there in the first place. Okay, so on to Kashigao. You get to Kashigao, 1 to 3 days walk from Arutinote. It's not accessible by road. It has 3 primary settlements, which you're seeing here. By the way, in phase 2 of the research, we mapped all the local infrastructure, which is how you're seeing the churches, the monasteries, the schools, and that's an additional spatial layer we have in the research. Kashigao is an unbelievably vulnerable place to landslides. They're surrounded by landslides 360 degrees. These are all landslides. These are landslides from the earthquake. These are landslides from the earthquake. The folks here do not have a very large tradition of aid. Not a lot of NGOs have worked here. And there's actually been NGOs that have been kicked out of this community by the community because of their own interest in having their community-based organizations do things. They have a very united group identity. They're all Gurungs and Gale folks, mostly, which is their ethnic group. They practice a very ancient form of Buddhism, whereas in Arutinote, it's more heterogeneous, where you have Buddhists, Hindus, and Christians. Here's an example of an active landslide and what folks are dealing with every day here. Last summer, the monsoon went long. This is October. It should have been sunny and dry. It was pouring rain. There was a waterfall in the middle of this landslide. These folks are collecting fodder for their livestock, and this is just a daily ritual where they're remaking the trail over the landslide in order to get the resources that they need. These are places we would never go and consider to be very dangerous. This is what it looks like to be at the center of one of these landslides. These rocks are as big as a Volkswagen bus, just to give you an idea of the scale of this. The whole top of this mountain fell down. It's going to be very difficult to stabilize all these slopes. Moving on to Gatlang, this is our accessible area that's in Rasua. It's accessible by road, another 8 to 12 hour drive from Kathmandu, depending on roads and conditions and blockages. It is part of a tourist area that at one time was marketed as the Tamang Heritage Trail. Tamangs are an ethnic group of Buddhist origin. They too practice of an ancient form of Tibetan Buddhism, migrated to Nepal hundreds of years ago, if not longer. And this site in itself was known as the Village of the Gray Roofs. And it was marketed like that as a tourist attraction. You're seeing the damage here from the earthquake, but if you could imagine what this would look like if all those roofs were the same. They have a very specific architecture in this area, and folks would come here as kind of an alternative form of tourism and trekking to have an experience of culture. To reinforce that, that means these folks have had contact with Westerners for longer. There's also more missionaries and more NGOs in this area than any other place. So it's an important thing to think about in terms of heterogeneity and really contrasts with some of the other sites we're working at, which you'll see in the data. Moving on to Haku, it's 1 to 3 days walk from Gatlang, not accessible by road. 50% or more of this area was completely destroyed. Landslides took out the entire villages, and folks have been removed and put into displacement camps. They're called IDP camps. There's a lot of literature out there that talks about how camps dislocate people from the land, interrupt social networks, and cause them to be dependent on external aid. And unfortunately, and I'll talk about that a little more, I think that's exactly what's happening. There's also no major plan for relocation yet of the folks in the camps, and we're almost at 2 years after the earthquake. So in Haku, it had catastrophic damage. That's the place that had the fire. These are children playing on a prefabricated home as a jungle gym. But by and large, the place was really destroyed. Places where we went and visited, no toilets, really, really difficult sanitation issues, out-migration to areas because of no opportunities here, issues with farming, which I'm going to talk to you about, and herding and other things like that. You have families being broken up into 2, so that part of them are in the displacement camps and part of them are in the village, because in the village you're able to take care of your livestock and your land, but in the camp you're able to get the handout from the government. So there's actually more households in the census of Haku after the earthquake than there were before, because people are trying to break into more parts so they can get more aid. Here's some of the communities that got annihilated by the landslides so you can understand what the landslides looked like. The communities were here and here, and they were basically in the direction of where these landslides fell. Some argue this is a road that was built to create a new dam called the Upper Trisuli Dam that's being built over there. And they put a road on each side of the street. And if you notice here, the landslide covered the road and almost blocked the river, which is called a Leduff, a landslide dam outburst flood, where a landslide blocks the river, creates a lake, it busts the dam through, and then you have hydrological event further on down the river. In this area, some argue that the slopes were actually destabilized when they did the blasting for the road. So there's a chance that this awful stuff that happened to folks was a result of the development of hydropower mixed with the earthquake. So, and there's literature out there that shows that blasting on steep slopes for hydropower actually helps to make more vulnerability to landslides. So, and I would argue that's what we're seeing here. This is what the camps looked like after 9 months. You see some placemaking at some camps. Other camps you don't see much at all. This is the camps after a year and a half. You're seeing folks sprouting their own vegetables, using their roofs as gardens, so some adaptation. I would also argue that folks aren't planning on leaving if you're seeing some of this behavior. You're seeing the reuse of things. This is like the Australian government giving out blankets 2 years ago. It's now the wall of one of the houses. This gentleman lost his entire family in the landslides and is trying to piece his life back together again. He had catastrophic injuries from the earthquake, but is actually working as one of the leaders at the camps to try and organize what folks are going to do next. And there's a lot of people who are in positions like this that feel invisible, feeling powerless, but are actually the ones kind of making this recovery happen for some. Okay, so as part of the project, we did some capacity and rapport building to make sure that this project both had folks involved in it from the local area, folks that were invested in this that would want to work on these topics in this project and others for the future, and also experts in Nepal that had experience with the cultures or with the area. So we recruited 10 staff members to be part of the project. We also needed translators because in the villages we worked in, there were up to 3 languages spoken, 1 to 2 indigenous languages and Nepali. We didn't necessarily expect that to be the case, and one of the reasons why is there's been a huge outmigration of men, working age men, which I'm sure resonates with folks who work in the developing world, since the earthquake to the Gulf countries and also to Southeast Asia. This was happening before, but there's been some increase in it. And a lot of those men were the ones that went to school and learned Nepali. So then when we got to the village, everyone spoke the indigenous local languages. So we needed to adapt a little bit in the project. We also conducted trainings for the whole team on ethics, theory, and methods. And this is really important to me so that we could start a generation of researchers in Nepal that was related to this topic. I'd also done some of this collaborative research with Native Americans in the US, and it was exciting to share it in Nepal and practice that. And lastly, we carry out community meetings both before, during, and after all of our research phases to return the research to the folks that have shared it with us, as well as the communities, and then get feedback for the next phase and where we're going. So we've done a bunch of those, so I'm going to take you through this a little. These are the trainings for the first phase and the team from the first phase. This is us going over initial results and what we were going to present to the community. This was when we initially presented the project to the communities. We handed out an explanation in Nepali. I know not everyone could read it, but it was as close as we could come to something to give. We gave out food. We made this just an information sharing session so folks didn't feel like we were just there to extract information. We also had to explain to people we weren't architects, engineers, or medical doctors, because by and large that's what everyone thought foreigners were after the earthquake. This is for phase 2, where we had a training of the trainers. So 2 of the leaders of the team, Umesh and Alyssa, were training the next group to come in and do the interviews, including teaching the theoretical framework. And this is practicing doing the surveys, going over results for the communities. And then in phase 2, we return the results from phase 1. And this is us returning the results to various communities. This is in Kashigao, this is in Gatlang, this is in Aruchinote. Aruchinote happens to be a really heterogeneous community with higher literacy rates. So we did a PowerPoint for them that was requested by us. So we did that instead. These other areas don't have electricity, so that would have been a little difficult to lug that up. Here's some pictures from the community meetings and all the participants in them. Here's another one. This one's in Gray, a village in Gatlang. That's Langtang Himal in the back. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you just a little selection of the preliminary results. As I said, these are the building blocks that I think are going to animate the model and some trends that I think are going to happen. I'm going to give a little bit of the qualitative research as well and talk about the implications in the end. Okay, so for our sample, the average age of the folks who participated in the study was 42. But the average age of the folks in the entire sample is 27. So that's showing you a little bit of where that working age male population is gone. Our sex ratio was 199 to 201. I did not fake that. That really happened. One reason why I think we had a lot of success, typically I have more success with the male than the female, being identifying as male myself, was that we had a more female than male team. And I think that this is one of the first research projects where I've been able to access more of the female population than I had in the past. Our ethnicities were by and large Tamang, Gurung, and Gale, with some other ethnicities mixed in. There's a good amount of Nuari people also, who are indigenous folks of the Kathmandu Valley, who are also from Aruchinote in the south. For religion, mostly Buddhist and Hindu, although I'm going to talk about the Christianity and how that's actually been increasing since the earthquake. Our average household size was about 5 per household. Our literacy rates were 62% for the whole sample, but you can see 77% for Aruchinote and 53% for Kashigao. Okay, so getting into some of our recovery indicators. Damage to primary house from earthquakes. 99.2% of our sample had their house damaged or destroyed by the earthquake. 81% destroyed, 18% damaged. So just trying to wrap your head around that. That means everybody after the earthquake was unable to go home and lived in a temporary shelter. Some folks, for example, in Gatlang, 92% of them are still in the temporary shelters. 100% of the local infrastructure across the board was destroyed in every place we worked in. I looked at 45 different buildings, and they were all destroyed in all those places. Earthquakes did a number on the farming. A large part of this are from landslides as well as cracks in the earth. So you have this unique terraced farming, which is a technological innovation of Himalayan peoples to be able to farm in marginal conditions. Imagine these steps that are going down at very steep slopes, and those being covered by landslide debris. Or having a major crack in the middle where all your fertile soil just went away. And we also had instances where the water table moved and animal population shifted and lacks of access to the fields themselves. So just giving you an idea here, 82% of Haku's farming livelihoods were destroyed. Only 1% of the sample was able to go home after the earthquake. Households able to return home after a year and a half. 92% of Kashigao is home, and we're going to return to that later. Why is Kashigao at home, but 8% of Gatlang is home? They're almost inversely related. You know, for every person that goes home in Kashigao, there's somebody not home in Gatlang. Haku, remember that 64 households are in camps, right? So if you take that 64% away, that means everyone is not home yet except for about 7%, right? And I'll be doing a sub-analysis on the camps versus those that stayed home. But really, focus on Kashigao versus Gatlang. That's a very important contrast here. 16% or 64% of Haku in our sample were in the camps. We thought that was very important because this is an experience that earthquake survivors are going through. We found an uptick in folks renting their homes after the earthquakes. This makes sense. People had their homes destroyed, no longer have that property. They're renting from somebody else. So phase 1 is on the left, phase 2 is on the right, and you can see that ownership went down and rentals went up. These are people's responses to how they felt that the recovery was going. And they were asked a series of questions like, does the earthquake continue to impact your ability to farm, herd, gather forest products, etc.? Every number that you see here in red was worse after a year and a half than it was after 9 months, which by and large you can argue that it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And that one argument could be that the earthquake is still going on, because there's been so many landslides, so many destabilized slopes, so many aftershocks since then, that folks have been so vulnerable they haven't had an opportunity to build back. And it's been one thing after another for many. So you're seeing that come across here. Just some examples of what folks said about farming. You have explanation here about fields going fallow, fields being covered by debris, insect or pests coming in and eating the stuff, erratic weather that happened during the monsoons, just a compounding factors that's making things worse. Here, when we're talking about herding and access to grazing, you have trails being blocked, animal behavior changing, grazing areas being affected by landslides, blocked trails people taking daily tasks much longer than they can, all kinds of observations folks are having. When it comes to collecting forest products, that you can't get to the forest, that the forest fires happen because of the erratic weather, or that because it went from really, really wet to really, really dry, less non-timber forest products, or having to travel further to get what you need. You could also argue that people are spending less time in the forest and farming, which is affecting the social relationships that are there as well. Here for rebuilding of community infrastructure, you can see across the sample, about half the schools have been rebuilt and about a quarter of the rest. But look at Kashigao again, rebuilding faster than everybody else. So that's an interesting thing to look at here. Gatlong, rebuilding okay. Remember, Gatlong's the area that has the most aid organizations and Kashigao has the least. So interesting little contrast there. Gatlong also has a lot of projects that are being built before the houses are done. So this is a major church, biggest building in the community, built by the Church of Latter-day Saints. Biggest building other than the monastery that's being rebuilt in the village. 8% of the people are able to be in their houses, 92% are in temporary shelters, but we have major projects of infrastructure happening. Issues rebuilding after the earthquakes. As you can see here, they're at about a 50% level, with Kashigao having a lot after 9 months. But after a year and a half, those increased across the board. Why is this happening? Well, there's a dearth of trained carpenters and masons that people are able to have and come build their homes in the ways in which the government wants people to make them to code. It's hard to get natural resources because there's, as you saw, a lack of access to the forest and other places. There are erratic events with weather, such as the monsoon and other things where people are afraid to build a more permanent structure, and etc. So lots of issues that are going on that are making it harder for people to rebuild as time goes on. Other changes, there's been a flip from microhydro to solar. So some communities that relied on microhydro, those were destroyed by the earthquakes, and they've changed technologies for solar power, mostly through interventions of NGOs. You also have everybody returning by and large to the electricity rate they were at by a year and a half after the earthquakes. Household access to the internet has increased since the earthquakes. This is something we want to look at more. I can't really give you any reasons other than interventions, or at the camps, for example, people in Haku might have access. And you can see people in Kashigao don't use it at all. But we have a huge uptick at Aruchinote and Gatlong and folks using the internet since a year and a half. Thinking about connectivity, I'm really going to focus just on the results related to social capital. Now, there's been research done on the 1934 Nepal earthquake that states that there was a lot of bonding and bridging that happened that helped folks in Kathmandu Valley recover from the earthquake, especially because the state back then was even weaker, obviously, than it is today. Well, we saw a lot of evidence of social capital in certain areas of ways that people were recovering and working together, in other areas where they weren't. So to look at help after the earthquake, to get a start, when folks immediately after the earthquake, within 9 months, we had the government act right away with giving quick payments, NGOs and INGOs coming in right away and doing projects, and help from family and friends being at about a 40% level. And then you can see 6 months later, it dropped off almost totally. And this is typical of disasters. It's a lot easier to raise money right after it happens than it is a year or 2 years later. Folks don't really look at the livelihood reconstruction piece as much as they look at infrastructure or the tangibles. And so you're seeing that a little bit. These NGOs are already at the next one, right? They moved from here and now they're serving another place. But let's focus on family and friends. Kashigao had the most help from family and friends after the earthquake, with Aruchinote number 2. And remember that part of Aruchinote has a homogeneity with Kashigao ethnically. So if we look at what happened after a year and a half, here we go. That's after 9 months. This is after a year and a half. So the help went down, but Kashigao still remained stronger. And evidence of this is by and large parma, which parma is a form of work exchange where people exchange labor in their agricultural fields. I help you if you help me. And there'll be these mutual aid networks. And you can see about across the sample, 66% use some kind of work exchange in their fields after 9 months, and after a year and a half, 50%. Now that's really interesting, but why didn't they use that to rebuild their homes in all the different places? So when you go to Kachigao, well, let me give you this in a minute. In addition to that, by and large, since a year and a half, there's been a lot of loans taken out and access to credit. But of that loans, 73% were low or no interest loans from friends or family compared to banks or microfinance projects. So there's a form of social capital here as well that is coming out in addition to the work exchange. Of all the loans, Kachigao still had the highest, although I wouldn't bank on these numbers particularly. I think more analysis needs to be done. Other forms of social capital, this isn't the annual Tihar ceremony, which is a Hindu ceremony, but it's being celebrated by Tamang Buddhists who have been in Nepal for quite some time. And we are going from house to house singing songs in the evening of this ceremony. And the song that we were singing, instead of it being a traditional Tamang song or something like that, it was a new song written by folks in the village about how they got damaged by the earthquake. And they were trying to go from house to collect money to rebuild the trails that were damaged by the landslides. So you saw folks adapting ceremony here like they were adapting work exchange in order to assist in the recovery. So let's go back to this idea of INGOs. Let's remember that Kachigao had the least and Gatlang had the most, although the other areas had pretty strong too. And then think about, Gatlang's got Save the Children, Latter-day Saints, Islamic Relief, Australian Aid, UNDP, they span the world. And also in Haku, in the areas that these NGOs from Gatlang aren't serving, you have a huge increase in Christian denominations coming out there and building churches. And there's actually an uptick of conversion to Christianity in a few of the different areas that we're documenting, even as much as just throwing crosses on the old monastery door and making it a church, right? So this is a new thing in this area. I'm not speaking to other parts of Nepal, but in this particular area, folks seem to be taking up the Christianity as it's associated with modernity, development, earthquake-resilient housing, things like that. So again, returning to this idea that we had a little bit of NGOs in Kachigao and a lot more in Gatlang, and then we think about what happened after a year and a half, and then we think about who's able to come home. And it's an inverse relationship. So the place with the least amount of aid had the most people home, and the people with the most aid had the least. So I'm going to propose that this is a form of a resilience trap, where folks know enough to do nothing, right? So they know enough in order to collect from the different aid organizations and governments that exist in their area rather than doing some self-reliance and doing it themselves. Research states that dependence on the state and other NGOs can cause a dislocation in social networks and a dependency on an external actor. And I think that's what's happening here, especially because they do work exchange, but did not help rebuild each other's houses like they did in Kachigao. This is 6 months time-lapse, not very well done photography, but what I'm trying to show you here is not much happened in 6 months' time. This is Gatlang. Nobody's living in any of these houses. Okay, so use of outside ideas in the recovery, something we're interested in. This is another anomaly. Mostly government and NGOs, those are the ideas that are being used. This could be earthquake-friendly housing, using hybridized seeds so that you have a more successful and resilient growing season. But Kachigao had the highest use of outside ideas as well. So I think this is interesting, and I think it's showing both bonding and bridging forms of social capital. Bonding being the type of social capital where folks from the village are helping each other out, and bridging meaning that you have access to new ideas. Now, why isn't Gatlang bridging, which is also decently high, but not that high? Well, maybe it's because of this dependency. Maybe it's because tourism has been there for almost 20 years. These are questions we need to explore more. Here's some examples of the outside ideas. Trainings by NGOs for construction, farming, earthquake preparedness, etc. Learning networks, we saw a little bit of a jump in this. So talk to someone about what to do in an earthquake or other natural hazard, pretty low after 9 months, increasing after a year and a half. And talking to somebody talk to you, also increasing. So a learning network is being developed here on what to do. And when we move into institutional participation, you're going to see an uptick in an institutional participation across the board. Farmers groups, women's groups, credit and savings groups, community forests even, all had upticks in the participation. And the literature on this states that disaster can often cause emergent networks, where new networks are created in order to deal with these complex problems. These are just some of the civic organizations that I was able to document, and it's definitely something that's increasing, and we predict to increase more. Lastly, focusing on social memory, the use of traditional building, I'd like you to show you that Kashigao rebuilt all their homes the old way. They tried to build them a little lower with less heavy roofing materials, so when the next earthquake happens, it's not as much damage on them. But other than that, they kept it in their quote-unquote traditional style. Now, what happened with this is the government came around and said, if those aren't to code, you need to pay to take them apart and rebuild them. Now, no one's going to do that in Kashigao, but that's what they're being experienced right now. So you can see the change in how they were viewing traditional architecture in the recovery from the 9 months to a year and a half. These are girls harvesting rocks from landslides. This was a common occurrence because local materials need to be sourced locally. And Kashigao is quite a self-resilient community. So every time there's a landslide, folks would go out and harvest the materials because these wonderful igneous rocks are much better for building than the metamorphic flaky rocks that are in their village. This is girls carrying them rock by rock. Use of farming in the recovery, you're going to see high levels for Kashigao, but also Gatlang in this one. And use of forest management, again, Kashigao higher than everybody else in this one. Also, there's been anecdotal evidence that there's been a run on resources since the earthquake and that folks are not necessarily following the taboos on harvesting forest products or following the rules of community forestry. So this is another aspect that we would love to invite a natural scientist onto the team and look at the impact of the local forests caused by the recovery. And just a few other variables that we looked at, folks feeling like their opinions being taken into account. Notice that Kashigao had the most values for both. Remember, they have the least amount of aid there. Gatlang had the lowest, and they have the most amount of aid. And then moving into optimism, you can see folks were not very optimistic 9 months after the earthquake. Look what happened here. And by and large, this is because of the government payouts and folks feeling like they're going to have access to the $3,000 US that's being given per household to be able to rebuild. Here, it was so chaotic, people had no idea of what was going to happen next. And you can see that in questions about pessimism, where you had Gatlang actually being the most pessimistic after 9 months, having the most help. And I guess across the board. But you can see the pessimism is going down except for Haku. And remember, Haku is mostly in displacement camps with no plan of relocation. So some emerging themes for you to take home today. 1, each community is recovering at a different pace. The speed of recovery is not necessarily dictated by geography or presence or absence of aid. Aid does not always match need. Connectivity, both bonding and bridging, is a key source of key in sourcing resources. Spatial inequalities are present, so the way in which Nepal designated the VDC needs to be revisited because there were so many ward-level differences. So what we've done is we've codified in the study accessibility by settlement instead of VDC so that we could actually look at the idea of accessibility and not just the idea of VDC, which was showing some inequalities, and the aid was definitely being concentrated to the roadhead, the market, or where the helicopter landing pad is. Parma, or work exchange, is being remade in select communities to rebuild homes, schools, monasteries, etc. The photo you saw earlier was women from Kashigao rebuilding a school. Civic participation is increasing. Planned and in progress large-scale hydropower projects are key factors in decision-making related to recovery. And social memory related to landslides, extreme weather, and water scarcity, as well as forest management, seem to be helpful, but not earthquakes. I found no information that people had on how to be resilient to earthquakes. And that's by and large, you could argue that's because they only happen once every 100 years in Nepal, a little bit more often, but not often in the same place. But the local knowledge related to these other things were aspects that were more frontal in people's lives. So here we are. I'm going to return you to the model. Now we're at the point where we're putting the data into this, and we're going to look at our 3 points in time to try and understand these questions of adaptive capacity and see if these different variable classes can predict the outcomes of our recovery indicators. And then we will follow them over time to understand the constructs of that social ecological system and if there's been resilience or transformation. Thank you.